Ended. Welcome to all of you to the Health Disparities Lecture Series. We have an esteemed lecturer today and guest who we are so happy to have join us. Nice to have you all in presence in the audience, and to those of you who are on our listening audience today, we will be able to have some Q&A, both in the room as well as for those of you who are on our Zoom audience. You may submit questions and we'll ask them towards the latter part of the lecture today. As I remind you, we created this lecture series earlier this year in collaboration between my office, the Office of Institutional Opportunity, with the School of Public Health. Dr. Omer has so kindly agreed to support this, and we've had 4 speakers. So far, we have one who unfortunately was forced to cancel and reschedule from last month, but we will reschedule Dr. Nunez-Smith again and let you know when her talk will be coming. And we have a couple of the talks that are actually part of next academic year, but they count in this sort of schedule that we've set up. That said, I am really happy to have a friend and colleague join us to speak today. Dr. Kirsten Bibbins-Domingo is a friend who years ago, we sat in the basement of a Holiday Inn in Bethesda reviewing grants, and I reminded her that we bought our own lunches and our own coffee to sit through 2.5 days at a time of reviewing grants and discussing, trying to get things through, something that hopefully is not going to go away in this day and age. But since that time, she has moved on and upward and is doing phenomenal things. She is the 17th editor-in-chief of the Journal for the American Medical Association. She's the Lee Goldman Professor of Medicine and Professor of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the University of California, San Francisco. She previously served as the chair and Department of the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, and as the inaugural Vice Dean for Population Health and Health Equity in the UCSF School of Medicine. She co-founded the UCSF Center for Vulnerable Populations at the Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital that focuses on actionable research to improve health equity and reduce health disparities. Dr. Bibbins-Domingo is a general internist and cardiovascular epidemiologist whose scholarship includes observational epidemiology, pragmatic trials, and simulation modeling to examine clinical and public health approaches to prevention in the US and globally. She previously served on and led US Preventive Services Task Force from 2010 to 2017. She has received numerous honors, including the induction into the American Society for Clinical Investigation and the National Academy of Medicine and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It's my honor and pleasure to give you Dr. Bibbins-Domingo.
Wonderful. It is a real pleasure to be here. I've had such a great time at dinner last night with faculty, and today meeting scholars and other faculty and learning about the programs and priorities at your institution. And so I am looking forward to this talk, but also to the discussion that I hope will follow. So first, let me tell you a little bit about me and about the JAMA Network. I then want to talk about how I have thought about and how we have thought about disparities as it comes to the type of content that we're publishing. And then I want to be a little provocative and talk about just publishing in general and why do we trust what we read when journals publish things? Are there forces at play that lead us not to trust things? And how should we think about them collectively as a scholarly community that cares about the health of our patients, the health of the population, cares about reducing disparities in health, and having a scientific basis to do that all. So there's a lot woven into this talk, but I only have about 25 slides, so hopefully we'll have enough time for discussion as well. So hopefully you know about JAMA. JAMA is 141 years old and is the flagship journal of the JAMA network. We have 11 subspecialty journals. Each of these have their own academic editors. JAMA, the role of the editor-in-chief, is a full-time position, and there are a number of full-time editorial jobs at JAMA. But we share a common publishing platform for all of these journals and common procedures and transfers across all of these journals. JAMA is a general medicine journal, as is JAMA Network Open, and JAMA Network Open is an open access journal. So JAMA, just to give you an idea of scale, JAMA publishes about 200 long form articles a year. JAMA Network Open publishes about 2,000. So you can see the scale difference. Also a general medicine journal interested in sort of a broad array of scholarly topics. So as you heard from the introduction, I am somebody who spent most of my life as a faculty member at UCSF. As a scholar thinking about health equity, as a general internist practicing at a large public hospital. And that's what I had spent most of my life doing. And I'm currently on leave while I'm the editor-in-chief. I had never been an editor before I took this job. So my experience of journals was an experience of authors, as somebody who was trying to get my paper published in JAMA, and the experience of a reader, like trying to figure out how what I'm reading applies to what I'm doing. And so I think that is the perspective that I've brought to a really strong, outstanding organization. And I think it's that perspective that I think about whenever we're trying to decide how we should move forward in particular directions, and also what types of forces are on the horizon that put the types of ways we think about scholarly publishing a little bit at risk. And so what I want to do is talk about, because health equity is the way I think about most of the things in the world. And that is the way that I've approached this with how we think about to organize for scholarly publishing. I'm going to infuse that throughout the talk, and hopefully we can have some discussion on this topic. So so I know from my perspective and my own scholarship, my own perspective of what I think is important as a clinician and as a researcher, the question is, how do we implement that across scholarly publications, and particularly at the JAMA network? The reason I decided to make this shift into something that I had never done before was because I saw real opportunities during the pandemic, both of what we did really well, and the ways in which science and communication about the science led to many great outcomes, and the ways in which science and the communication about science also sometimes didn't lead to optimal outcomes. And since journals sit at that center, both in determining a little bit what's important, what we should pay attention to, how we communicate it in a ways to reach many different segments, other scientists, other clinicians, academic communities, patients directly, lay press. How we think about that as journals can really shape the impact of science for what we think is important for evidence-based practice. So let me start first with how I think about disparities and scholarly publishing. And here I start with what we know. And I think for all of you and I've been so impressed with all of the ways in which this institution has been thinking in many ways about health disparities. These are probably statements that I hope are familiar to you, and we might disagree on the margins, but we probably all can acknowledge these. We know that the social context for health matters. It matters for how we experience health, how populations experience health. We know that the social context matters for how we practice medicine, and we know it matters for what we decide to study in science and how we conduct science. And that the factors that shape this context then directly contribute to disparities in health. They contribute to differences in how we practice medicine and differences in how we prioritize what science is more important or less important. And this is just saying that all of these things matter. And so as we think about this, we have to acknowledge that this type of context really shapes all of the variation that we see in all of these ways in which we think about the health outcomes as well as the practice of medicine. So when it comes to journals, I think the important thing to know here is that journals have considerable power. And they have considerable power because journals, for better or for worse, really are some measure of prioritizing what's important, right? So the decisions that journal editors make to publish something, the manner in which they publish something, the context around which they publish a scientific finding, the decision to publish along this line and not this line, that has power. That says to the broad set of segments that I've talked about as being the audience for journals, this is important and this may be less important. One of the stories I told last night was my first publication in JAMA when I was an early career faculty was a paper that was rejected. And I had a great mentor who taught me how to appeal a rejection, and that one can actually appeal a rejection. And I had the wonderful experience of a JAMA editor sitting down with me and my mentor and basically saying, you know, when JAMA publishes something, people pay attention to it. So we can't publish something with this intermediate outcome that you have. You've got to give us some hard outcomes because you've got to give us something that tells a clinical audience this matters. And it was such a formative experience for me because I realized I got to hear how the editor was thinking. The editor was thinking about the impact of the work that was being published and helped me to think about then as an author, how do I think about putting that work together? And so journals have power, and hopefully more people will have the experience that I had early on in my career of editors communicating the types of things that make the science that one is publishing have greater impact. But the reality is journals are also shaped by their social context, just in the same way medicine and the lives of our patients and the scientific context is shaped by society, and that influences what is published. And I think the challenge for journals, which at the end of the day are only run by a bunch of people who are trying to make the best decisions possible, is to figure out the strategies to reveal what we think is important, to create processes that are fair, and that we are in a constant mode of questioning and saying, are we doing the right thing in what we publish to advance our goals of advancing health for patients and populations? So what we've thought a lot about is what does that mean? In some ways, it means starting with who do we have in the room? I think the risk for journals is that they become very insular. They recognize that they have power and they know what's important. And for me, I'm not comfortable with that type of power. I would rather have more people with different types of expertise, with different types of experiences, helping me to understand what's important. And I think that who's in the room actually matters. And that applies to who's in the broad collective room. That includes the reviewers, that includes the people who work on our teams. And that includes the ability to have a variety of different perspectives represented and to be able to call on different perspectives when evaluating types of scientific work. There are two things that were important for me when I started at the journal. One was that we really invite those who are early in their careers to understand how journals work. So we introduced quite a number of fellowships to invite those who are early in their careers to be a part of that process. That for things when we were talking about disparities, that we had the right types of reviewers who were really expert in an area to weigh in on a particular way of thinking about a particular article, and that we had expertise in the types of disciplines that, as we're increasingly a multidisciplinary scholarship, to understand the latest in observational methods. One of the first hires I made as an editor-in-chief was of statistical editor who said to me, I know this is a really important hire and I hope I can live up to your expectations. And I said, why? And he said, well, I know I'm the first non-MD editor that you've hired. And I think even that small way of thinking that there are so many ways in which scholars from other disciplines other than medicine really help us to shape, especially, and understand the social context for health was really important. And we've thought about this both geographically, both from the areas of expertise, and frankly, differences of opinion on a variety of different issues has helped us to have richer conversations about the types of things that we publish. The process is also important. We want the process to be fair. You want to trust that when you send something to me, we have a team that is going to be able to evaluate it fairly and to give you an answer back about the process that we've developed. And I think that that comes through even more for areas that might be newer, or that might be important, like the area of health disparities, but we might not always have the right type of expertise in the room. We want to make sure that the process is fair, and that even appeals to that process are also handled in the same way. And we want to constantly be looking at our processes and saying, are we doing this in the right way? Do we see the right types of outcomes that we want to see? That ongoing quality improvement process is one that's important as well. And then finally, we want to think about the content and thinking about how to amplify the content that is important. So we think about, I've told you we're 13 journals, but oftentimes issues of health disparities, they cut across any given field in that our journals represent. And so one of the things that we had introduced maybe a year and a half ago was having an equity table of contents that describes the content across our network that's related to the theme of equity. And I talked to one of your scholars this morning about that particular email. And I think that's a way in which we are trying to think about content the way people want it delivered to them, so that scholars who are thinking about issues of equity and implementation can think not just within their narrow scope of practice, but also how we can learn from others, from other disciplines. We've thought about that with AI as well as another example, just because that is a technology that cuts across cardiology and oncology and general medicine. And so we've introduced other types of channels so you can just review that type of content as well. I think a lot of this is just important both for maintaining the priority of areas we think that are important, of maintaining a fair process where we're also always engaged in self-reflection to make sure that that process is fair and balanced, and then looking through to make sure that that content reflects what we see as the important issues in science and medicine. So I'm going to weave the issues of equity in throughout this talk, but what I want to talk with you about is really the fundamental issue of trust. Oh, I probably shouldn't have clicked that, right? Oh, there we are. Okay, of trust. So what do I mean by trust in medical publishing? What I mean here is that when you send a paper to me, you want to trust that my process is fair and balanced. You want to trust that once you get through that process, if you get to publication, that it's going to be published. A reader of a journal wants to say, that peer-reviewed paper has been vetted in some sort of way, and that means I can at least trust it to that extent. And this entire system of scholarly publishing, especially its interaction with the broad set of communities that are a part of the biomedical enterprise, really is built on trust. And what I want to describe for you now is three forces that are at play that I think we all have to be thinking about that have the potential to undermine trust in the scientific publication process, as well as have the potential to help build trust. And I say this not as a way to give you answers, but as a way to engage you as an academic scholarly clinical community in this process of thinking about how do the things that we hold dear, evidence-based practice, how can we think about that? Because all of that requires the type of trust that's inherent in the publication process. So let's start first with one of these forces. So this is a headline from the Wall Street Journal. Flood of fake science forces multiple journal closures, right? This is, of course, not JAMA network journals. This is none of the journals you publish in, but this is a headline of a major paper, and so that makes a difference. There's this headline: how does bad data slip through? Allegations of research fraud raise questions about peer review. Troubles arise among pressures to publish. Too many journals, too few reviewers. This is a major institution in Boston. Again, not your institution, not my publications, but when these types of headlines hit the big press, these are the types of things that lead people to say, can we trust those big institutions? Can we trust the thing that's published in science? Do we trust the things that are at journals? We hear that there's a lot of problems with them. The reality is that Americans' trust in science has continued to decline since the pandemic. This is true worldwide. It is definitely true here. And this is true across political affiliations. And it's something that we all have to think about, because even though we ourselves are doing the best we can and are not the source of this, the fact of the distrust is something that does have an impact on all of us. It does have an impact on how people think about funding, how people think about the priorities that one should pay attention to, how people think about what is published, and if it conflicts with a view they have, whether we can actually trust it and engage in, or just assume that scientists can't be trusted. So we know that misinformation is a major problem. People are concerned. And the striking thing is that most adults in the US are concerned about false or inaccurate information, particularly when it comes to health. This is true regardless of political affiliation. Most people think that nobody is doing enough about the fact that there's a lot of bad health information out there. This is from a KFF poll, and that took place before the election. Trust and recommendations about health issues. You can see that this goes, depending on your political affiliation, you might trust the person and the party in power or not, but in general, most people have a low amount of trust of where they're getting health information, with the notable exception that they trust their physicians. So regardless of political affiliation, people do trust their physicians, right? And I think this is something that is striking to me, because no matter what the issue of the day is that we're concerned about, the perception of what we publish, the perception of information, my experience is that my colleagues who are outstanding clinicians are excellent at communicating across differences. They're excellent at communicating with people who might have a different point of view than them. They're excellent at getting people to understand why something might be important for their health, even if it goes against another view that they have. And I think that's the experience of most clinicians who do and like that type of engagement. The challenge, I think, is how we do that at scale. So how does a journal, how do authors think about the communication that recognizes that not everyone is coming from the same starting point, but that we need to communicate about the scientific basis, both what we know and the things that we may be unsure of? How do we do that, and how do we do that well across different populations? And that is the challenge, I think, that we're all facing, because individually we seem to be able to do this one-on-one in our clinical encounters, but at scale, there's a lot more challenges here. So the first trend that I want to talk about that we should all be aware of is that there is a rise mistrust in science. And we can talk about the many things that are at play here. But I think it is something that we all have to pay attention to, not just with the knee-jerk, well, obviously you should trust us because we know what's going on, but rather think about all of the ways in which we have to communicate in order to build trust. We have to communicate in a way that recognizes that we don't always have the same starting point. And I think both of those factors and how we navigate those are really going to be important for our academic institutions, for the conduct of science, the practice of medicine, and certainly for scholarly publishing. Let me talk about a second trend. These are three unrelated, but you'll see how they weave in as well. We think a lot about accessible science, and for me, this is very much an equity issue, that we want science to inform clinical practice. We want to be publishing in areas that relate to all of the populations that might be affected by variations in care. But we know that the models of scholarly publishing are not always such that all of the information is accessible. One of the things that we did soon after I started as editor-in-chief is to make sure that all of the research that's published across the JAMA network is publicly accessible. That means on the day of publication, an author can deposit their manuscript in a public repository for no money, for no charge. We have 2 open access journals, as I mentioned, so we do believe in the open access pay to publish model, but we also believe that what's most important is the accessibility of scientific information. This is something that has been talked about for a long time, and we were really proud to be amongst the first of the clinical journals to take this position. In this editorial, what we wrote about was equitable access to publishing. So the open access way of thinking about publications, you give a publisher money to publish your article, really puts the emphasis on the availability of science to read. What less attention has been paid, though, to the issues of equity with respect to the availability of access to publish. So for those who might be early in their careers, who might be in less well-funded disciplines, less well-resourced countries, less well-resourced institutions, the ability, who might not have the capacity to pay to publish, this practice is not equitable and it is damaging to science. And I think about this a lot as somebody who spent many years mentoring people who are early in their careers and people who are engaged in the scholarship around health disparities, which is oftentimes can be a less well-funded set of endeavors. And so we wrote about this, and we basically called on the publishing community to think about not just equitable access to read, but how can we have a publishing process that also is equitable from the standpoint of who has access to publish. And then we wrote about paying for the things that we value. And so we're in this funny place right now where we do need access to high quality, robust information. In my view, that includes the peer and editorial input that comes from the traditional ways we think about publishing. And we need to make that accessible both for scholars to be able to publish and to be able to reach a broad audience. And the question is, how do we pay for those types of things and what models work for that? I want to talk a little bit about the dark underbelly of open access publishing. Again, not to dispute that there's not a value to open access publishing, but to talk about another trend that I do worry feeds into some of the mistrust of science. So we published a viewpoint on this 2 years ago now, talking about the rise of these very large mega journals. And this basically is showing that over time, over the last number of years since we've been doing more open access publishing, there are more and more journals, and there are more and more journals publishing more and more articles. And so you can see here, I said our JAMA Network Open Journal publishes 2,000 papers a month, 2,000 papers a year, that some of these journals are publishing 10 times that amount. And this was a 2-year-old number, so I'm sure that is higher now. Now, I will say many of the journals on this list are outstanding journals. They're journals that I have published in. They're journals that I like to read. I know the editors-in-chief of these journals. So this is not to cast aspersions that being a large journal is bad. But it is also true that a large number of journals on this list have been delisted. They are those journals that are the fake journals that have been actually pulled. And there is a tension here in the pay to publish model that I think has the potential to breed journals that without attention to the quality is challenging. The editor-in-chief, the former editor-in-chief of the BMJ, wrote about this, that in science publishing, money and publications have a corrupting influence. And he quotes in this article that there's a saying in English and perhaps in Italian that misconduct occurs as the result of either money or sex, but in science, it's money or publications. And I think what he's saying here is that as academic institutions favor more and more publications, and journals favor being paid for more and more publications, this creates a synergy that is not, it has the potential for problems. And why do I think that this is important and how does this relate to equity? Well, I think it is important because there is both the quality of the overall publications, but also the burden, especially on those early in their careers, especially on those less able to navigate all of the ways in which these publications occur, to understand what publications might be of higher value or of lower value. And that is of concerning to me as we think about the next generation and those who are building their scientific careers. We wrote about this as a group of the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, wrote about the particular manifestation of this, which is predatory journals. And these are journals that are really out to take your money and then not publish your papers in the way that we think about them. There's a lot of evidence that suggests these predatory journals are on the rise. They are on the rise in part because we do have models now that really favor the pay-to-play publication model, that they've become very sophisticated in what they're doing. And I do worry that particularly folks who are early in their careers can fall victim to these. If you want a really insightful article on this, well, I recommend our editorial that was published across the journals here because it has some recommendations for what authors can do, what institutions can do, what journals can do to try to avoid what seems to be a rising tide here. If you want to have a sense of what happens when you become victim to these predatory journals, I really recommend this piece that was in Science, which is from a postdoc who had his paper. He submitted a paper because he saw one of his colleagues on the masthead of the journal, which was fake. And he then paid to have his paper published and then paid to try to get his paper back, neither of which he was quite successful in. And so I think it's quite an important manifestation of this, and one that I worry about, particularly those who are early in their careers and who have that pressure to publish. So we talked a little bit about mistrust in science. We talked about accessible science and why accessibility is important, particularly for issues of equity, but about how the underbelly here can make for really ways in which particularly those who are earlier in their careers can be victim of what are predatory processes amongst journals. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence. And I like talking about artificial intelligence because I think it is both part of the solution, and if we're not paying attention, can be part of the challenge of trust in science as well. So one of the things we're quite bullish on AI, both as an intervention in medical practice and as an innovation in scholarly publishing. We think that AI will help authors to write manuscripts that are more clear. That's particularly true for those who are not native English speakers. That might be particularly true for those who are early in their career, or this is first time publishing in particular medical journals. We think that AI can help make content more accessible, adapting to languages other than English, adapting to lay audience, and adapting more and more content. We put so much attention and effort into original investigations published at JAMA, but the main message of those investigations should really be published in many, many more ways for the multiple segments of the audience to make it more accessible to them. And there are many ways in which the features of generative AI can really help in this way. And it might help us over time to find content. We're all in a little bit of an environment of information overload. So finding the things that we want to read ends up being important. And in the area of health equity scholarship, I think this is particularly true where sometimes you are not going to find things just in your journal, but you might find things in a related journal or a related discipline that might be important to you. And I think there are many ways in which some of the analytic and generative features of AI can help us find content along the traditional siloed ways we think about content. We were early on in trying to help authors understand how to use AI responsibly. So ChatGPT was November 2022. This is a guidance we published for authors in 2023. And basically saying that we know that authors are going to use these tools. They can use them responsibly, but no, ChatGPT cannot be an author on a scholarly publication. When we published this in January, ChatGPT had already been indexed as an author multiple times in PubMed and in Google Scholar. So this was trying to figure out like how authors, humans, still take responsibility for their work, even as we have other types of more innovative tools to help us to think about how to do that work better. We know, of course, that authors are using these tools. And here's, of course, an example from the medical literature, not from JAMA, but you see in this introduction that reads here, certainly, here's a possible introduction to your topic, lithium metal batteries. So this is clearly, a failure of authors and failure of editors to edit appropriately. And we know that the number of authors who tell us that they're using this, which authors are allowed to do, but also the other hints that these are being used, which there's a little bit of a scholarship around that, suggests that these are in use and in widespread use. We know that there are some limitations to the traditional, at least general models, large language models. They're prone to hallucinations, which is a little bit challenged for scholarly publishing. This looks at the older version, 3.5 to the newer version at that time, 4.0. And basically in the red box, you can see these are citations that are completely made up. And so this is a known factor in most of the large language models. And again, one of the things when we talk with authors, it is about paying attention to the citations and what's actually there. We know the hint is that ChatGPT is being used in peer review. And since peer review is one of those great uncompensated services that we do for the sake of the medical literature, it's not surprising that tools will be used to do this more quickly, more efficiently. I do think there are many ways in which AI are going to help us to actually do peer review a little bit better, make some aspects of peer review more efficient. But as now, we're still trying to work with peer reviewers and with authors to give guidance on how to use these more appropriately. So when it comes to AI and trust in publishing, we worry a little bit about the widespread use and mostly the improper use of large language models. And so we've tried to issue a lot of guidance on how to do this well. We worry about evolving verification and attribution of particular content to the author of the original content. I think that will become increasingly difficult over time. We worry about fraud. We certainly didn't need AI to have fraud because we know fraud exists in the medical literature, but we worry about specific types, and that would relate to wholesale creation of data and those types of features. And we worry about fraud at scale. So I think if there was an attempt to really wreak havoc on scholarly publishing, certain AI tools would have the ability to do that in a way that would really pose challenges. So I've talked about three trends. There is a rising mistrust in science, and we should all be aware of that. We should think about ways in which we individually and how collectively as a community we can think about strategies to mitigate that trust. That mistrust. When I think about it from an equity lens, I think about all of the many different communities that might have their own issues around trust in institutions and in our medical establishment, and how we overcome that individually, but have to do a better job in thinking about how we overcome that institutionally. I think about accessible science as one of those wonderful forces because it raises the idea that we really do have to make information available to people in order for them to use it. But that the flip side of this model of how we've gotten there, which has to do with the open access pay to publish model, has this dark underbelly, which I think has the potential to feed mistrust in science. And then I think about artificial intelligence, one of the tools that really both has the ability to make scholarly publishing more accessible, has the ability to make medical care more accessible, but that understanding how to use that in a responsible way, in a way that recognizes the biases and limitations of artificial intelligence is part of the challenge in thinking about this. And I come back to what I think is fundamentally at the core of what we care about when we think about evidence base for medicine and public health, the ways in which our biomedical community, whether we're at academic institutions, whether we're in scholarly publishing, it relies on the idea that we can trust what it is that we are communicating amongst ourselves and to the general public. And so understanding these forces that are at play and what we can do individually and collectively and across our sectors to continue to maintain the trust is really important for the future of our work. All right, with that, I am going to stop and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, we have a couple questions from our listening
Oh,
audience.
wow.
First question, how will we be able to access the recording? Oh,
No idea.
what qualities to you constitute an expert in the field, and are there objective criteria journals to use to define areas of expertise?
Yeah, this is really great. I think that for so it's easy to say expert in the field is somebody who has published in that particular field. That would be the sort of minimum criteria. I am somebody who is very interested in cultivating the next generation, the people who are coming up. I think there are folks who are early in their careers who might have lots of knowledge in a particular area who can be very useful to me as an expert reviewer if that area matches what I need to know. And so and I believe that's our obligation to continue this practice is to cultivate those who might be early. I think it is wrong to think that journals make decisions just based on peer review. Certainly we don't at JAMA. The peer reviewers are aspects of our information that we use to help us to make better decisions. But we're trying to always integrate all of those things together to understand what makes a good paper and how we should publish a paper responsibly.
Thanks, Kirsten, for a nice overview of a challenging landscape that's getting even more challenging with time. So my group is involved in chronic kidney disease research, which we consider to be the poster child of health inequities. And we wrestle often with, when we are applying for grants and we are submitting manuscripts, what the assigned value is. Is it a moral value that we are assigning to the work, or is it a practical value? Because from our standpoint, we think if we figure out a way to make health disparities in chronic kidney disease less in vulnerable populations, we'll lower the incidence and the impact on society overall. So in terms of how JAMA or even you personally approaches the value of equity research, do you consider it more moral, that's what we should be doing, or very practical in terms of its impact on society?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I would say it is both. Well, I fundamentally, I take a pragmatic view, but it's probably guided by my values, which is ultimately moral. So I believe that I want to give information to clinicians or to public health practitioners for the types of problems they're going to see. I don't think that I need to assign value to reducing disease in a smaller population, and to show that because that small population has big health issues, that's why I have to care about it. What I want to be able to do is to tell you, if you're the practitioner, that this is the information you need to know for the patients you're going to take care of, right? That's the only thing of value to me. And if that is important and you can communicate that to me, that is something that we want to think about publishing. And so I guess, is it a moral thing? No. Do we just do it because it's right? No. I'm guided by, what do I as a clinician want to know? What do I think other clinicians should know to be able to take care of the patients in front of them, even if at a population level, that might represent just a small fraction of the patients. For some clinicians, that is their patient population. So that makes it of value.
Thank you so much for visiting us. And my question is about trust. And nowadays, I see that we're doing a lot of effort for more transparency for the investigator to even sharing the data, publishing the codes, and that's very good. But I still see that we are using a very obscure peer review system. that nowadays there's no accountability for the peer reviewers, that in some instances they provide like 20, 40 comments and they use one sentence for rejection with no accountability. And that's a very old system. And I see JAMA as the innovator leader. Is there a point that we will do something about changing that obscure, no transparent system of peer review?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're speaking to a range of the problems as I see it. So if I want to say how the experience of peer review at our journal, hopefully you did not get a rejection letter from us that has 40 million comments, or even a revise and resubmit that has 40 million comments without a very clear paragraph from the editors saying, we thought about this. This is the most important comment. This is why this is the most important thing you have to address. For our readers that are general readers, this is the thing you have to pay attention to. Because ultimately, we are not making decisions based on the 40 things. We're making decisions as editors based on our judgment of a variety of different factors. But I think we don't always do it perfectly, so you might have gotten that letter from us. I do think the issue is that I think the issue of what you're talking about, though, is true. Like, we can afford to do that because I have a lot of full-time editors who spend a lot of time like looking at every journal. Not every peer-reviewed journal can do that. And I've already told you that this rise in the number of peer-reviewed journals. So I think my concern is that that devalues what peer review actually means then, because we're not all using it in the same way. My colleague, who's the editor-in-chief of one of the preprint servers, he reminds me all the time, people criticize preprint servers, but he reminds me all the time that the studies that show that COVID was started in volcanoes or started in snakes, that those were all in the peer-reviewed literature, right? They're all in the peer-reviewed literature. And so there is a question of like, this system has a variety of flaws. It is amplified by the fact that we now have a variety of journals that are peer-reviewed journals. And so how can we make it better? So I would love to hear your thoughts on how to make it better. There are a number of questions of like, can we make it better by paying peer reviewers? Could we make it better by helping me making more clear to peer reviewers what I actually want in a peer review? Can we make it better by editors talking about how we thought through this process? There are a variety of different ways, and I do think we have to do it. Can we make peer review open? Some people believe making it open and more transparent. Each of these have, I think, a lot of potential, and we've thought a lot about each of them. They all each have some downsides. And I think the challenge is whether we're trying to solve peer review for JAMA or we're trying to solve it for all of the peer-reviewed literature, which I think is much more variable. Yeah.
Thank you for a very stimulating talk. My question kind of backs up a few steps to address this perception that we hear so much about, that the elite, the expert elites are telling us what's important to us.
Yeah.
And so that, in terms of publishing, that raises the question about how editors, editorial panels, boards prioritize the scientific questions that ultimately get published, given, you know, the acceptable level of quality. And so I'm interested in how you all make those sorts of questions or decisions around these priority questions.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And I think that there are, so this is one of the fundamental questions that's going on right now, I think. And it's one that I speak with my editors about a lot. And there are probably two ways in which I worry about us doing this wrong. So, and one more than the other. So one is that, you know, I only have 200 papers to publish a year. I can't possibly figure out, like, there's always a judgment call and we're going to get it wrong, right? So then the question is, like, it's not a priority for us, but that does it mean that it's not a good paper and it shouldn't be a priority for someone? Probably not. And that's where we've tried to think a lot across our network of journals about how it finds a home, where it's going to find a home. But I think the other issue that you didn't say explicitly, but I think is part of the narrative, is how much of my preconceived ideas of what's important, how much can I question those when something comes that challenges the very basis of that idea, right? So not a priority, like I think cardiovascular disease is more important than GI, not like that, but that, like, it's challenging the prevailing view in science of a particular way of thinking about something, right? And that's where I do think journals have to actually really challenge themselves to make sure they have a process that's in place that doesn't just say, well, we all believe this, right? We all know this to be true, because it's both bad practice. It also, I think, is just bad science, right? Because some of the most interesting things in science are those that challenge the prevailing view. And I think the challenge for a journal like ours is to think about, how do you publish those things where you're not really sure about what the implications are, or you're worried that if somebody raises a question about this, that it might lead them to quickly dismiss this, right? And so we've tried to both think about, as editors, how do we challenge our own assumptions? And I try to create an environment where people are always going to be asking that. And then if we're going to publish something that's a little more on the edge, how can we publish enough around it so that we can be stimulating the discussion as opposed to saying, well, no, that was wrong and now this is right. How can we say science is complicated, right? Things evolve. Like, we're publishing this because there's a lot of interest in this area, but we should be careful about this. And so I think you'll see us publish a lot of editorials with our science, mostly because we're trying to put more context around things and have more discussion. But it's that latter one that I worry, because there absolutely, it is true that, you know, we come in with our own biases and our own beliefs of like what we think the prevailing wisdom is.
Here we go. Hi, my name is Kimberly Burt, and I thank you for your lecture. Number one, it was very informative, and I really needed to hear it, honestly. But I've had like growing disenchantment because what I'm finding is that when you start to get into areas like disability, mental health care, and LGBTQ, stuff like that, there's a perception of, we don't know how that works. It must be fake because we don't understand it.
Yeah.
And then there's no publication. So what I'm finding is, even though I have hundreds of people that I personally have observed, the larger medical community hasn't observed it. And those people are afraid of the medical community because they've been treated poorly from lack of understanding. How do we even begin to combat that?
Yeah.
And like the general concept of like change occurs very slowly. You have to do change management, and there seems to be a general fear of just disability in general and accepting that it exists. And I've been kind of noodling about that for a while, and I was wondering what your thoughts were.
Yeah, I think it's such a great example of a topic that a set of areas that it absolutely is important for how a clinician practices, for how we think about policies related to health, but that understanding the science and making sure we have a team that can really evaluate the science is challenging. I think we as editors try to think about those areas and say, if this is not something that is amenable to the science, can we think about another part of the journal, right? Can we think about a clinical insight, which might say the science is emerging in this area, but this is really important for clinical practice. So can we publish in that way? Do we have the right type of, do we have the right people with the right expertise to comment on a different article? So if we have an issue that's raised in another thing, can we bring in that area by having an editorialist, a commentator who is an expert in disability, talk about it from that perspective? So it's not always perfect. And so I invite anyone to call us out on it. But we're trying to think of the way, we have multiple tools we can use, right? And the question is how, if something is important, the science is not always of the same, it's not always the way we've traditionally thought about the science that's important. And so we have to think about other levers within the journal to use.
It's after 1 o'clock and I think we've got to close, but if you have other questions and want to come down to the front, that would be fine. With that said, Dr. Bibbins-Domingo, thank you so much for joining us today and giving such a wonderful lecture. We appreciate all your thoughts and look forward to more from you.
Oh, wow.
Small gift of our appreciation.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.